So welcome to everybody here in this room as well as online. I'm Wasima, and I have the honor to introduce to you our today's speaker in the series of Decolonizing Europe. So Piro Rexhepi, I'm sorry if the name, I hope I said it right, research focuses on decoloniality, sexuality, and Islam. His recent work on racism and borders along the Balkan Refugee Route has been published in a range of mediums in and out of academia, including the International Journal of Postcolonial Studies, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Critical Muslims, and The Guardian, among others. He's the author of White Enclosures, Racial Capitalism and Coloniality along the Balkan Route, published in Yale University Press in 2020. It's a pleasure to have you here. You will have a lecture and we will have enough space and room for questions and answers later.
Thank you. Thank you, Nasima. So I first want to thank Fatima for the invitation, but also for her work, which was the main inspiration behind this project, as I already shared with some of you earlier in the day. And I also want to thank the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration for the invitation as well. I want to start the presentation by going back to 1970s Yugoslavia and look at the personal history and the politics of Melika Salibegović as a way of hopefully getting around to address some of the issues and people that inspired the book. So Melika Salibegović was a Yugoslav writer from Bosnia. In the eyes of the Yugoslav state, she was considered a promising cadre by all measures. As a member of the Communist Party, a member of the League of Writers of Yugoslavia, and a Muslim woman from Sarajevo, she was the type that the Communist Party was on the look for in the 70s, as they believed that her generation would confront their increasingly fractured brotherhood and unity at home, but also Yugoslavia's standing in the non-aligned movement abroad, as some of the non-aligned states had started to critique Yugoslavia for its treatment of its Muslim populations. Melika was also politically aligned with the Yugoslav third-rate vision, as she believed that Yugoslav non-aligned politics had played a significant, if not central, role in imagining an alternative world, one not defined by the Cold War conflict, but one where post-colonial world would decenter the historical dominance of the global North and make places like Yugoslavia, India, Egypt, and Indonesia the successful models for post-colonial development. Like her brother, who at the time was working on a Yugoslav development project in Iraq, Melika had developed close relationships with students from the Arab world, studying at Yugoslav universities as part of larger non-aligned collaborations and exchanges. Considering her exemplary standing, in 1975, she was sent from Sarajevo to Paris on Yugoslav stipend to do a PhD. In Paris, she came in contact with another intellectual crowd from the Arab world. But unlike the Arab students she had met in Yugoslavia, the Arab intelligentsia she would meet in Paris, especially Abdelkader Khatibi and people around him, saw the Tito Nasserist modernizing project as a continuation of the colonial regime through socialism and secularism. Through this crowd, Melika discovered the works of Ali Shariati and Jalal Ali Ahmadi, the foundational thinkers of the Islamic Revolution, whose arguments centered around the Islamic decolonization politics, and for whom the brewing Iranian Revolution was the central political question of the possibilities for a truly decolonized Islamic future. In her early engagement with this new intellectual crowd, Melika wrote that she could not accept their traditionalist approaches to Islam because as a Marxist, she saw what she believed were romantic tendencies of idealizing pre-colonial pasts, a dangerous prospect that could produce reactionary movements. In response, she remembers that most of them thought that she was ignorant of how the Titoist Nasserist project really worked on the ground to silence and stifle Islamic critics. Inspired by these engagements, on a summer break in 1977, she decides to travel to Iraq to visit her brother, but also visit Kerbela and the shrine of Imam Ali, where she later remembers she fell into Shahada and returned to Islam. By 1978, she abandoned her studies in Paris, now seeing Western education through the lenses of Jalal Ali Ahmad's West oxification or a reproduction of the same colonial narratives, and decided to return to Yugoslavia and dedicate her time in politics to the question of Muslim rights in the country. In Sarajevo, a political network of like-minded people had already formed and she became close to Alija Izetbegović, then the leader, the unofficial leader of the Mladi Muslimani, or the Young Muslims movement. Alija Izetbegović was a no small figure in this new pan-Islamist international that had emerged in the fringes of the non-aligned movement. He was the author of the 1969 Islamic Declaration, which by the mid-70s had been translated and read throughout the Muslim world, and went on to become a significant text around which the contours of post-colonial Muslim politics were considered. While she grew close to Mladi Muslimani, she never actually became a member of the group, and instead started to develop her own tactics and politics of resistance. Her first act was to show up at the Congress of the League of Communist Writers of Yugoslavia in Belgrade in 1980 with a full chador, as at this point she had covered herself. The niqab and headscarves had already been made illegal in Yugoslavia with the onset of post-war socialist policies of emancipation of women in the 1950s. Some of her colleagues thought that this was a performance piece, others took it more seriously. As the movement grew and she and her comrades traveled around Yugoslavia, the Balkans, and the Middle East in the next couple of years, they would be placed under surveillance by the Yugoslav state security forces. And in March 1983, she would be arrested along with 12 other key members of the movement. The Sarajevo show trial, which you see here, as the court process came to be known later, charged the Muslim activists with conspiracy against the state, attempting to bring the Iranian Revolution to Yugoslavia, and the intent to overthrow the Socialist Federation. Evidence and questioning was extracted from about 600 informants, co-workers, and collaborators, letters to and from Khomeini, and various texts that addressed the situations of Muslims in Yugoslavia and the socialist world. Eventually, they were all handed sentences from 3 to 15 years imprisonment, with Melika receiving 5. I wanted to first address the Sarajevo process because the clampdown on Muslim communities was not just happening in Yugoslavia in this time. In the early 80s, throughout the socialist world, authorities started to target Muslim communities as a wave of racism towards Muslim populations gained a momentum in the larger context of the Iranian Revolution, rising petroleum prices, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Around 1 million Muslim Bulgarians, for instance, at this time, were targeted for forced assimilation and given Bulgarian names in the extensive undertaking devised by the Communist Party called the rebirth process. So the rebirth process thought that the conversion of these Bulgarians to Islam during the Ottoman period was considered a civilizational misalignment from the Bulgarian national awakening and enlightenment, and their return to Bulgarianness through socialist secular modernization in the 1980s was considered the end of this cycle of escape from their true Bulgarian identity. The irony was, of course, that most of them were given Christian names by the socialist secular state. Resistance to the rebirth process ranged from protests to armed confrontations with the Bulgarian authorities, and Muslim workers spilling milk on the streets or putting broken glass and sugar at sugar plantation plants. In one of the many court documents from the Sarajevo trial, Melika was questioned for saying that they should have learned that that's something that they learned about labor subversion from all the socialist emancipatory projects that were enacted on them. The response from the West was surprisingly either supportive or silent on these suppressive measures, considering that minority rights until then had been a dog whistle in the overall Cold War confrontations. Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America addressed these measures as harsh but necessary undertakings. In August 1982, for instance, as Yugoslav public and authority were debating the influence of the Iranian Revolution on Muslims in Yugoslavia, Radio Free Europe produced a program called Dangers of Pan-Islamism in Yugoslavia. Drawing in these intense political debates, it argued that Yugoslav participation in the non-aligned movement had helped to establish a bridge between Muslims in the Balkans and their core religionists in the Arab world, endangering, therefore, both sides of the Cold War camp, but especially Europe at its gates. In these now frequent analyses, Muslims in the Balkans appeared as a weak link, or the green transversal as it came to be known, that is the Muslim-populated belt that connects the Middle East with the Balkans, and frequently problematized as a geostrategic threat to Europe. Today, that area, which in the 80s and 90s was called the green transversal, is named as the Balkan Refugee Route. Part of my book looks at how the events that produced the global Islamic threat in both Cold War camps were functionalized in the border regimes that emerged in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. I trace, for instance, how much mediated celebratory fall of the Berlin Wall at the time and its symbolic meaning for the unification of Europe displaced new civilizational borders, to use a Huntingtonian popular term of those days, along the Mediterranean and the Balkans. A common way of thinking on the genocide on Muslims in Bosnia, Kosovo, or Chechnya was thought as a seemingly civilizational but actually racial struggle to secure borderland zones from possible encroachment into Euro-American territories. As the then French president François Mitterrand argued, that while the war on Muslims in Bosnia was unfortunate, it was, quote, a painful but realistic rebirth of Christian Europe. This, of course, leaves one to imagine that a rebirth of Christian Europe meant providing a final solution to the question of the Muslims in the Balkan borderlands. Around the same time, then Senator, now US President Joe Biden, reminded the Albanian Diaspora Congress in the Bronx that the conflict in Kosovo was a civilizational choice and that they were standing at the hinge of history, that they had a choice to make and they, quote, will remain in the backwaters of Western civilization or join the painful process of total integration into Europe and the Western world. And now that you've arrived at that moment where you have to decide, or more accurately, you have to decide where you will go, end quote. This very clear-cut and straightforward 1990s solution about which populations go globally were not disconnected from population controls at home, because as Biden was reminding Albanian diaspora in the Bronx that they were white and belonged to the West, he was also sponsoring the 1994 crime law at home that would encourage states to build or expand their own correctional facilities, which would further the mass incarceration of Black Americans. So my book, White Enclosures, is an attempt to think through how US and European involvement in post-socialist spaces was not only an important geopolitical undertaking in integrating Eastern Europeans into the border project as a buffer zone against the larger civilizational and racial threats assumed to be coming from somewhere further east. It was also a moment that served to legitimize new modes of US domestic racial violence. What I'm trying to argue here is that the control of non-white populations at home with population control at the geopolitical borderlands were not in fact contradictory nor new, but rather renewed 20th century Euro-American concerns over race as a global, territorial, and border question. So in my book, I look, for instance, at how early 20th century US concerns over racial mixing, demographics, and race war at home informed not only US involvement in post-Habsburg Eastern Europe, and especially in the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, but also in articulating a global vision of a racially segregated world. Centered around the Journal for Race Development, American intellectuals who later came to be known as Atlanticists studied and debated the territorial boundaries of the white race, where the Balkans frequently figured as a predicament, and one that would become a considerable generative point of view for their vision of a Euro-Atlantic racial alliance. In returning to the early 20th century to look at the geopolitical racial mapping of the world, I try to think of how newly formed countries like Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, and later the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes were mandated with re-Europeanizing post-Ottoman spatial and social relations. A key feature of this de-Ottomanization project was the expulsion of Muslim populations through the newly emerged institutionalized measures in the interwar period, like the League of Nations population exchange that legitimized the mass-scale movement of Muslims from the Balkans to Turkey and the Middle East, and Christians from those regions to Greece. Muslim populations that were considered indigenous to the Balkans, such as Albanians or Bosnians, were granted some rights either within the emerging Yugoslav kingdom or in semi-sovereign Albania. Pomak Muslims in Bulgaria, on the other hand, were subjected to village baptizing, as it came to be known. In most, if not all newly formed post-Ottoman states, Muslims that remained would become the substrata of these societies. I argue that the racial stratification of post-Ottoman Muslim populations at this period was particularly powerful, given that it came with new biopolitical forms of governance offering opportunities for nation-building elites to test new modern approaches to health, education, and sanitation with a mission of civilizing, ordering, and orienting the locals towards fulfilling European life. Gender relations were particularly important, as most European and American anthropologists, ethnographers, and eugenicists alike who had arrived to study Balkan populations. This is, for instance, the picture of the Albanian men from Koman by the German ethnographer Paul Trager from 1910, and the other one is the Harvard anthropologist Carlton Kuhn, who's measuring the skull of an Albanian Highlander in the 1920s. So most of these academic undertakings of the time thought that although the local Balkan populations were of Aryan stock and with the right genetics, these populations had nonetheless acquired wrong morals under the Ottomans, and through their Islamization, men in particular had fallen prey to the Turkish sin. So I want to zoom in one of these civilizing projects for a moment to give you an example of what those conversions of the locals from Ottoman homosexuals to European heterosexuals looked like. The International Control Commission of 1913 was a European civilian military mission installed in Albania along with the German prince to supervise its post-Ottoman independence and guide its European re-Europeanization process. It was concerned with the prevalence of men sleeping with Kucheks or with other men. Now, from a contemporary reading, the Kuchek is a cross-dressing and gender non-conforming sex worker in the late Ottoman Empire, like the one you see here. These images and similar ones were meant to propagate the criminalization of sexual relations with Kucheks, but they were not the only forms targeting Kucheks and their clients. In the broader context, the purpose was to eradicate all forms of homoerotic male bonding, of which Kucheks were just part of a much larger Beyteji culture, as it later came to be known after the term Beyteji, which means poet singer. These were, of course, not entirely top-down civilizing missions, as local landed elites were deeply invested as mediators of the colonial modern project. For Albanian nationalist elites, who understood their geographic position in Europe as incompatible with the religion of the majority of its population, disavowing Islam and any cultural traits associated with it became imperative to their racial return to Europe. So the saving, straightening, and secularization of the Albanian male in the post-Ottoman period is one way to think about how these early 20th century racial bordering regimes were operationalized through sexuality. In the book, I try to address how the durabilities of these colonial and race-building projects in post-Ottoman and post-Habsburg period are repurposed in the post-Cold War moment to renegotiate racial realignment with Europe, but also how the reconstruction of colonial sites and institutions in recent years bring into sharper attention broader questions about the uses of coloniality to think about contemporary making of race and border regimes. In this regard, for instance, I look at how the Islamic community of Bosnia, an umbrella religious organization designed by the Habsburgs to govern various Muslim communities under their colonial rule there, that same institution today, for instance, draws on its colonially regulated religious practices to legitimize its suppression of illegal mosques who veer off the legitimate and European-like Bosnian Islam that the institution promotes, or how it makes reference to the Habsburg 1912 Islam law to fight the radicalization of Bosnian Muslims who supposedly come under various radical Islamic influences, always elusively addressed as the Arab world. It is in this sense that I look at how references and revivals of colonial institutions serve to harness a kind of liminal whiteness for the Muslims in the Balkans in exchange for their disassociation with Arab and African migrants traveling along the Balkan route. In his frequent visits to Bosnia, for instance, the former Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz regularly warned Bosnian authorities that the threat of radical Islam influences could endanger the Euro-Atlantic integration of the country, urging Bosnian authorities to confront the radicalization, but also to use Bosnian forms of moderate Islam to impose a new religious regime for all Muslims in Europe. In 2015, Kurz had already amended the Habsburg colonial Islamic law of 1912 to close down mosques in Austria that were receiving foreign funding, most of the mosques belonging to the Arab community. Part of these larger securitization of sacred spaces in Austria also targeted Muslim academics and activists, especially those that work on Islamophobia, such as the recent case, for instance, of the chief editor of the annual European Islamophobia report, Ferit Hafez, who is one of the 60 Muslim activists and academics whose homes were raided by the Austrian security forces in November of 2020 as part of an anti-terrorist operation named Luxor. In Bosnia, these politics would also endanger a process of surveillance and criminalization of mosques that refused to come under the control of the official Islamic community of Bosnia, managing to close almost all of them. Considering the efficient work in closing down mosques, the Islamic community of Bosnia opened a representative office to the European Union in 2016. It argued, among other things, that the purpose of the office was to ease EU anxieties over the potential mixing of Bosnian Muslims with Arabs, just as Bosnia was being assessed for its Euro-Atlantic integration. The Grand Mufti of Bosnia, Efendi Hussein Kavazovic, reassured EU and NATO officials that, quote, Bosnian Muslims are indigenous Europeans and committed to cooperation, and that our Islamic institutions are modern European structures established not by the Ottomans, but by the Austro-Hungarians, and more importantly, that Bosnian Muslims should not be confused with Asians, Africans, Turks, or Arabs. During the last decade, in writing about Islam in the Balkans, I sometimes find it odd how a new number of racist tropes have emerged in Balkan Muslim communities and the reasons why. And the only sense I can make is that to consider how the 1990s trauma structures and shapes this aspirational whiteness. So one way to think of this kind of Balkan borderland whiteness is one that demands recognition and sometimes even access to those privileges it is promised. It frequently feels like a fear of the return of those reprisals not only forces this self-fashioning as a different type of Muslims, autochthonous, white, European, as a way of distancing from those much more feared refugees and radical Islamists, but also to police the second and third generation migrant Muslims in Europe who seem to be testing the limits of European multiculturalism. Because somehow, having been on the receiving end of that stick, Muslims in the Balkans feel like we know how quick those tables can turn. And to speak of turning tables, I now want to turn to Aziz. Because in researching and writing the book, I was accompanied by his music, and he naturally became part of the project. So for those of you who don't know Aziz, I'm not sure what to say other than look him up on YouTube. But briefly, Aziz is a Bulgarian Roma, gender-bending, agent provocateur, and artist whose moves and music have continuously confronted this rising racism that I talked about, but also queerphobia in the last 2 decades. Early in his career in 2004, Aziz decided to place a billboard in Sofia showing his ass to the Bulgarian national hero Vasil Levski, who fought for independence from the Ottoman Empire. Aziz was promoting his new single Kak Boli, or How It Hurts. That's this picture here in pink. In public debates in the years that followed, as Aziz dropped one provocative video after another, he was continuously attacked for weakening the moral fiber of Bulgarian society, for tempting Bulgarians towards anal desires and cross-dressing, and for diluting Bulgarian music with Gypsy and Oriental influences. But in the last decade, Aziz has increasingly responded to the overall normalization of anti-Roma racism in Bulgaria. More directly, especially in the events of 2017, where most of Bulgaria was overtaken by racist rallies against supposed increased Roma aggressions. The rallies came after years of public priming of the rise of bad human material, quote, demographics, as the Prime Minister Boyko Borisov called them. His governing coalition had passed a law on criminalization of radical Islam, closed down Roma Muslim community mosques, organized demolition and displacement of Roma people, and had provided overall support for the border vigilante groups that emerged in 2015 during the famous refugee crisis. The Bulgarian government, in a push and pull, assured its citizens that it was mitigating the dangerous trends in Bulgarian demographics that were in free fall in contrast to the rise of Muslim, Roma, and refugee populations. The government's approach to tackle the Roma problem and the demographic crisis was functionalized through the appointment in key positions of government, people who had expressed explicit racist approaches to physically enclosing and then displacing Roma urban communities. The appointment of Valer Simeonov, for instance, as the head of the Bulgarian Council on Ethnic Minorities for Integration in 2017, who imposed strict welfare measures targeting Roma communities, and in the parliamentary debates that accompanied the national strategy for Roma integration, argued that the Roma were becoming, quote, overconfident and voracious great apes, wanting the right to be paid without working, sickness benefits without being ill, child care for children who play with pigs in the street, and maternity benefits for women with the instinct of street bitches. What brings to existence the belief of our dark fellow countrymen that everything is permitted, that everything is allowed, and that everyone is obliged to feed, clothe, and give them treatment free of charge, end quote. The Minister of Defense, on the other hand, Krasimir Karakachanov, had simultaneously issued a manifesto for the integration of the Roma people through an American solution, built Roma reservations, organized around the American indigenous reservation model, where they would generate their own income from tourists and make abortion free of charge for Roma women. The political framing of these actions have made the Bulgarian government a model for many far-right and fascist groups around Europe who have come to see Bulgaria and the Balkans more broadly as an examples of connecting unapologetically white supremacy, demographics, and border security. So I've thought through the reconstitution of Bulgarian post-socialist whiteness with Aziz, not only because his music has been a constant companion, like I mentioned, but also because his solidarity with migrants and his choice of Muslim stage name in the backdrop of a long history of forced name changes, his attention to the stored Kuchek sensibilities that he awakens with his music, cross-dressing, and dancing, troubles the colonial designated temporal and territorial coordinates that produce people in Bulgaria or the Balkans as categorically different from the refugees that pass along the Balkan route. And that Aziz is heard in Belgrade and Beirut alike speaks volume of the common post-Ottoman affective and aesthetic commonalities that challenge these racial colonial borders. So in closing, I want to say that this was a long process. This book was a long way in the making, but it was also a difficult one, in part because so much of the scholarship on race, racism, and whiteness is centered on the US. And thinking about racism outside of the US usually lends you to a critique of US cultural imperialism, because Eastern Europeans, much like Western ones, see race as an American issue, coloniality as a Latin American issue, and what is to be studied in this area study constellations is obviously ethnicity and interethnic tensions. So this is, of course, in no small part a product of various studies, epistemologies, and politics. But my book isn't so much about how US racism informs more recent white supremacist formations in Eastern Europe, but rather how the playbook of EU-US white supremacy revives and intersects with more situated and sedimented forms of Eastern European racism. One of the points I try to make is that from the perspective of Muslim and Roma histories, Eastern Europe is not an exception to European colonial and racist present past, but its logical extension. In exchange for EU membership, countries along the Balkan route have installed the border infrastructure with EU funding for police, carceral refugee camps, and pushbacks with parallel political projects of encouraging racial and religious differentiation, which I addressed. If the invasion of Ukraine by Russia proved anything in this sense, is how much more willing the West was in accepting white Eastern European war refugees from, say, the Syrian ones, and how keen they were that for a moment the critique of empire was displaced from them onto Russia to generate at least a momentary innocence, but also to recenter Cold War cliches around authoritarianism versus democracy. But the invasion of Ukraine by Russia also brought attention to some less acknowledged trappings of colonial and racist legacies in Eastern Europe and the ways in which they connect to larger histories of coloniality. The narratives that emerge out of the invasion reveal a particular kind of concern, on the one hand for the geopolitical territorial borders of Europe and whiteness, and on the other hand for the ideological survival of liberal internationalism. So from the perspective of racialized and colonized communities in Eastern Europe, like I said, but also in post-Soviet spaces, from the Balkans to Central Asia, the Russian and East European colonizing projects were no different from the Euro-American ones, in as much as Russia and other smaller East European colonial legacies I address in the book had merely copied Western methods in a hope of becoming part of it. The reason I think Milica Salibegovic and Alija Izetbegovic are important in thinking about coloniality from the former second or third world, it's because already in the 1970s, they saw that the failure of post-colonial project of modernity, rather capitalist or socialist or the third way, failed to produce a revolutionary break from the colonial constellations of power. For them and Muslim thinkers who ascribed to the same Muslim international, it wasn't a choice of which European-inspired political project they had to choose from, but moving beyond them and in the process articulating a decolonizing project rooted in Islam. So in many ways, when we talk about coloniality, as defined by the Latin American school, namely that post-colonialism is a continuation of colonial regimes of power, we are also talking about questions being raised across the second and third worlds. I think I'll stop here and maybe we can have a conversation if you have any questions. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was extremely interesting and generative. I myself work on German responses to the Yugoslav wars in Germany and kind of the reception of Bosnian and Croatian refugees and kind of the discourses that come out of that and how they intersect with a process of German reunification. And so your project really illuminates some of what I'm interested in. And I guess I'm just wondering if you in your research, I mean, how much of your project is about the experience of Balkan migrants in Western Europe and how that then is kind of resituates the conversation within the Balkans itself.
Thank you. I mean, that's an interesting question. I unfortunately haven't done any work on Balkan diaspora in Europe, but I know several people who are now working on it. One of them is Adem Ferizaj, who's doing his PhD on the Albanian diaspora in Germany, for instance, and the ways in which Albanian diaspora in Germany finds its place in this very unusual position where they interact with the Turkish community and they are seen as part of the larger POC communities, but in Austria they're not. And so it's very interesting how malleable those concepts are or how contextual they actually are. But also I think it's an interesting point of view to think how the diaspora also influences these views, in part because a lot of the nationalist projects in the 90s were also sponsored by the diaspora. I mean, there's a reason that Joe Biden speaks to the Albanian diaspora in the Bronx, because the Albanian diaspora in the Bronx, along with the Albanian diaspora in Europe, were sponsoring the Kosovo resistance. And so it was very important for the American political establishment to convey to the Albanian diaspora that the message you need to send back home is that their struggle has to be aligned with their integration into Europe, just in case they're entertaining any other ideas, of course. So yeah, I'm unfortunately beyond that. I mean, in terms of contemporary politics, I haven't necessarily looked at how the diaspora intersects in these politics.
Thank you.
Hi, first of all, thank you. So much of what you've presented today was new to me. And I think that widening our horizons is fascinating and important. I have been in various Balkan countries as an academic tourist looking at sites of Holocaust memory and history, but never through the lens that you presented it today. I've also written on border studies from the Cold War angle. So since enclosures is in your title, I'd like you to comment a little bit on how you see the notion of the fractured borders moving through Cold War and into the current era as part of this crisis of Muslim identity and Muslim rights in the Balkan countries. And I'd also be grateful if you could talk a little bit about present pressures from the point of view of EU accession. What's pushing and pulling societies into alignment according to what you're presenting as racial white capitalism conformity, and where are there opportunities for hope in various parts of this, where you see that models might be presented that could work against some of that, given the fact that EU accession seems to be pretty dominant.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it is very dominant in politics in the Balkans, of course, but it's also been dragging for about 30 years now, with countries that managed to get in, like Bulgaria, Croatia, Slovenia, and Romania, and the rest of the countries that are being left out. And this, of course, plays in several ways, because to suggest to the French public that you're going to integrate another 5 to 7 Muslims into the European Union is not a great perspective. I mean, that's how that domestically is seen in France and Germany, but also it's how it was seen in the Brexit debates in Britain. I mean, one of the posters, for instance, from the Brexiters was that Albania is joining the European Union in 2020 something. And so that was the message itself, meaning that do you really want to be part of the same union? And so I think the EU plays a very interesting role here, in the sense that it needs to appease those white supremacist forces at home who have managed to gain quite a bit of power, not on their own right, but in the way in which that they've seeped into mainstream politics. Their arguments have seeped and merged with mainstream politics. And on the other hand, it has to continuously police the Balkan borderlands, because that's where it's not just a matter of the integration of those countries, but it's also a source of refugees. And so also these countries are seen as not capable enough to kind of install and maintain the borders. So it has this interest in integrating them for security purposes, but that there's a racial incompatibility that constantly has to sell to European populations who are, at least from the mainstream political point of view, not very keen on receiving any more others. And so enclosure, I think, is maybe one way. So if we think, for instance, in coloniality and decolonial studies, the Latin American school of thought speaks of coloniality as a project that starts with the colonial expansion, the settlement, the colonial settlement projects of the Americas, and way into the present, right? And so enclosure may be a closing act, because we're no longer talking about necessarily a territorial expansion, but rather this needs to kind of create borders around what is considered white territoriality. The Euro-American, Euro-Atlantic, transatlantic alliance, whatever you want to call it, is more or less an effort to create this impenetrable zone. And I think these politics are mitigated by multiple questions that the far right has managed to insert into the mainstream politics, key among them, of course, being the demographic question. And sometimes when you listen to European, especially, but also US authorities talk about demographics, you're not sure if you're listening to some conspiracy theorist who talks about the Great Replacement. They're just using different language, but they're more or less making the same argument that what's at stake are the demographics. And so, of course, this is one of the reasons for the enclosure, for the creation of this border zone, from the US-Mexico border to the Mediterranean to the Balkan routes. And it's very close policing. But like I said, it's also very closely tied to domestic politics. I don't think those things are separated from one another. To the historical aspect of it, I mean, I don't think it's also something that just immediately emerges after the end of the Cold War, that the Euro-American project of integration, namely integration into the EU and NATO, is just this border that just comes out of nowhere. Like I was trying to say in my presentation, this is a much older racial project that goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, where Europe and European and American intellectual anthropologists, eugenicists, stormed all these post-Ottoman spaces to kind of check and measure the skulls of these people to make sure that these are indeed white people, despite their conversion to Islam, and they can be given the privilege of being civilized and access to Europe and markets and wealth and health, obviously. And so I think in many ways, the post-Cold War Euro-Atlantic integration is a revival of that project. You know, like every grand world-making project is a very porous process of constantly shifting and changing strategies, but the goal, for sure, is the creation of impenetrable sort of white Western enclosure. And the other thing I wanted to say, because you mentioned you did studies with Holocaust remembrance in the Balkans. In Bulgaria, for instance, this the rise of the far right, but not just in Bulgaria, throughout the Balkans, usually begins framed around some World War II collaborationist, anti-Semitic fascist generally, who during the socialist period was, for obvious reasons, erased from history, or if he was used, it was used as an example of how the Bulgarians, let's say, collaborated with the Nazis in exterminating the Jews. So the revival of these figures is also very interesting. So like, this is the kind of project that borrows from various historical points to create this narrative of white people being under demographic threat from Muslims, Jews in the past, refugees and so forth. And so it labors into especially the last century, it labors into the 20th century with different historical figures to kind of create an image of Bulgarians being under threat. I mean, one of the terms they use in Bulgaria for it is that by 2050, Bulgarians will become an extinct exotic minority, that people will go to Bulgaria to look for them because they would have disappeared. And these are not just far right or conspiracy theories, like I mentioned. These are ministers in the governments, the coalition government of Bulgaria, who use this language in the national parliament. And so I don't necessarily think that's better or worse than the West. I just think that it's more out in the open. And so while they desire Europeanization and they've become members of the European Union doesn't have a problem with them that they're racist. The European Union has a problem with them for saying it out loud for what they really mean, which isn't necessarily what happens in Brussels or Washington for that matter.
Thank you. I agree, Judeo-communism, its legacy gives rise to that sort of surfeit of explicit discourse in Central and Eastern Europe that a Western European or an American can find quite shocking. In fact, it's absolutely what the far right has taken advantage of and is normalizing. Are there points of hope among the Muslim communities themselves? This was the last part of my question, really.
Yes, sorry. I mean,
I acknowledge the severe threat of the extreme right, but I would like you to kind of pull back to how you began your lecture, following through on particularly her narrative and how build on that.
Well, they don't make Velika Salibegovic anymore, for sure. I mean, she was quite, I feel privileged to have met her and spent time with her. I don't know what to say on that question because I mean, everything is so, at the present moment, so overdetermined by the question of integration that there's no room for people to even imagine what an alternative outside of the European Union may look like. It's kind of like what Mark Fisher says in Capitalist Realism, that we can imagine the end of the world, but not the end of capitalism. And it's so true because, I mean, you can watch so many movies today about apocalypse, but not about the end of capitalism. And so in much the same way in the Balkans, you can imagine the end of the world, but not the end of European integration. So I'm not sure that I can say what that hope may be. I mean, for me personally, people like Aziz, because Aziz is not somebody that emerges by himself out of nowhere. These are larger trans and queer communities who, I have to say, have been at the forefront of showing solidarity with refugees, at questioning some of the narratives that have emerged in the last 20 years, in building queer kinship outside of the traditional heteronormative communities. These communities offer me hope in the sense that they embody and live life, or they're not necessarily theorizing worlds that they want to make, but they're making the world as they live, so to speak. So outside of that, it's hard for me to imagine a larger transformation happening in the region for the time being. I mean, maybe for the worst, but not necessarily.
I have a question. Boy, am I wading into waters that I do not understand. I work on medieval Spain, but I wanted to come to your talk because of I work on environmental history and because of the title Enclosures in your book, and also because I have been reading a little bit lately about the ecological effects of Christian crusade in the Balkans, and hearing your talk, which was very interesting. I feel like I learned so many new things. I was reminded of the similar enclosures around whiteness and Spanishness in the present day, and these, rhetorical arguments and appeals to Reconquista and Crusade that right-wing groups in Spain often reach for in their rhetoric. And I'm wondering if that type of rhetorical strategy is also present in the Balkans. I'm thinking of the Crusade of Varna, and if that is also an idealized past that is deployed in a way to sort of perpetuate enclosure.
It is. I mean, it's not unusual for a lot of the nationalist movements to go back to medieval mythologies and the struggle against the Ottoman conquest, in much the same way that the Spanish narratives around the Arab conquest are waived and reused in modern history. But I think also the word Reconquista is used even in the Balkans as a terminology. For instance, in during the war in Bosnia and the siege of Sarajevo, there were international battalions of mostly white supremacist forces who joined the Serb Republika Srpska army that surrounded Sarajevo, and a lot of them saw themselves as reconquistadors of the Balkans. That this was the last part of the Muslim Europe that had to be cleansed. So if Spain was the last moment where the Arabs were kicked out, the Balkan Wars in the 90s were the last efforts to get rid from Europe of the last remaining Muslims. And so for this terminology, they frequently use the term, I mean, they called themselves conquistadors in the sense that reconquistadors, in the sense that they were reconquering after all this time that territory that naturally should belong to them. So there are many parallels, but surprisingly, nobody's done any comparative work, because I think that would be very interesting.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.